The wind in Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains has teeth. It's a dry, brutal cold that finds any exposed skin and worms its way through the seams of the most advanced cold weather gear. It's the only thing moving. Below the wind, in a rocky alcove just big enough for two bodies, Navy SEAL Jack Callahan was a statue carved from ice and shadow. He lay prone, his breath controlled into a faint mist that vanished instantly in the sub-zero air. His large frame was encased in state-of-the-art winter camouflage, rendering him nearly invisible against the snow-dusted scree. His face, the small portion visible between his helmet and the gaiter pulled up to his nose, was a mask of wind-chapped skin and focused gray eyes. Those eyes, currently scanning the valley 5,000 feet below through the powerful scope of his suppressed rifle, hadn't blinked in minutes. Beside him, just as still, was Thor. Thor was a massive German shepherd, his classic black and tan coat a familiar icon of disciplined strength against the mountain's gray and white. He was a four-legged weapon, an extension of Jack himself, and currently serving as the world's most sophisticated early warning system. His intelligent amber eyes scanned the same valley, his ears twitching at sounds Jack's protected hearing couldn't detect. He shivered, not from cold, but from coiled, disciplined energy. This was day 4 of a mission that, officially, didn't exist. Jack and Thor were a two-man Overwatch team, deployed deep into a region controlled by a heavily armed private military corporation that had gone rogue. They were miles from anything resembling a town, miles from any support. Their world was this mountain, the sterile smell of gun oil, and the whisper of encrypted data bursts they sent to their handlers every 12 hours. Their target was in Jack's crosshairs, a sophisticated anti-aircraft missile system, cleverly hidden in a fold of the terrain. Jack was a hunter, a ghost. His job was to watch, report, and remain unseen. His job was not to engage. He was the eyes of the operation, and his silence was his armor. Thor's head came up a fraction of a second before Jack heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a sound that didn't belong here. A low, tearing hiss that grew into a violent, ground-shaking roar. Jack's scope snapped left, tracking the plume of white smoke erupting from the very missile system he was observing. The missile climbed, a white slash of malice against the deep blue of the high-altitude sky. No, Jack breathed, the word a puff of vapor. He followed the missile's trajectory up into the thin air where the blue bled into black. And then he saw it high above, a glint of silver, the ghost of a plane that had been invisible moments before, trying to pull an impossible G-turn. It was a government surveillance craft, sleek and vital, and now horribly vulnerable. The missile was faster. There wasn't a grand explosion, just a brutal flash of metal. The silver jet shuddered, its advanced shape broken. One wing tore away, tumbling like a dark leaf. The fuselage, trailing black smoke and orange fire, began its long, silent fall. Jack watched, his gut turning to ice. The sound of the impact reached him seconds later, a flat, dry whump that echoed off the surrounding peaks like distant thunder. Thor let out a low, pained whine. "Easy, boy," Jack whispered, his hand finding the dog's thick ruff, the contact grounding them both. His eyes were glued to the falling wreckage. The enemy would be scrambling. The pilot, he searched the sky, his heart a heavy drum against his ribs. Come on, come on. There, far below the tumbling debris, a single pale flower bloomed against the gray rock, a parachute. The pilot had gotten out. Jack's mind, normally a cold, calculating machine, became a storm. He watched the white chute drift, tossed by the same vicious winds he was enduring. It was descending into a heavily wooded basin, about 2 miles from his position and perilously close to the enemy's launch site. He didn't need the scope to know what was happening below. The enemy wasn't stupid. They'd seen the chute. They would be moving. Trucks, foot patrols, trackers. They would be racing to capture a high-value federal agent. Jack knew what capture meant out here, in the lawless territory this PMC had carved out for itself. It was a fate worse than death. His training screamed in his head. Maintain mission integrity. Observe and report. Do not engage. He was compromised. He was a ghost. Ghosts don't intervene. He reached for his comms unit to send the burst report. Aircraft down. Pilot ejected. Coordinates. He paused. His thumb hovered over the transmit button. He looked down the mountain. He could already hear the distant grind of gears as trucks moved out of the enemy camp. They would be there in 30 minutes. The pilot, likely injured from the ejection, would be lucky to last 10. Thor, sensing the shift in Jack, nudged his cold nose against his master's arm. The dog looked up, his gaze intense, waiting for the command. Jack thought of the pilot, alone, hurt, watching enemy trucks draw closer. He thought of the creed, The one that mattered more than any mission parameter. Leave no one behind. Screw the mission, he whispered. He keyed the comms. His voice was raw, but calm. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Overwatch 1. I have a visual on a downed U.S. aircraft, grid coordinates. He sent the location. Pilot ejected. Single shoot. Descending into the basin. Hostile forces moving to intercept. I am breaking mission. I am moving to engage in search and rescue. He didn't wait for the inevitable Overwatch 1, maintain your position, from a commander safe on a base 1,000 miles away. He switched the unit off. The silence was absolute. He was offline. He was alone. The switch from observation to action was violently fast. Jack was no longer a statue, he was a blur of lethal efficiency. He broke down his sniper rifle, stowing the scope and collapsing the stock. The heavy observation gear was left behind. He switched to his primary weapon, a suppressed Mk18 carbine, flicking the selector off safe. He checked his sidearm. He slung the light assault pack filled with ammo, water, and medical supplies onto his back. He knelt in front of Thor, who was trembling with anticipation. Jack clipped a lead to the dog's harness. A formality. The dog would never leave his side. "All right, boy," Jack said, his voice low and hard. "New job." He pulled a small sealed bag from his pack and let Thor scent the sterile fabric inside, the smell of a government-issue flight suit. "We're going hunting." "Find." Thor gave a sharp, clipped exhale of understanding. Jack stood. The carbine was held at a low ready. He and the dog launched themselves from their rocky perch. They didn't run. They moved like ghosts, at a swift, ground-eating pace that was both silent and fluid. They used the terrain, leaping from boulder to boulder, sliding down scree slopes in a controlled fall, their movements perfectly synchronized. Thor led the way, his powerful black and tan body flowing over the snow and rock, his nose tasting the wind. Jack was right behind, his gray eyes no longer scanning, but hunting. Below them, the shouts of the enemy patrols grew louder, echoing up through the basin. The race was on. The descent was a controlled fall. Jack and Thor moved through the steep, pine-choked terrain like water flowing downhill, always finding the path of least resistance. The air, thick with the scent of pine needles and cold stone, now carried a new, unwelcome smell, the acrid tang of jet fuel. They were close. The shouts from below were clearer now, a mixture of harsh commands and brutish laughter. It was the sound of overconfidence, the sound of predators who believe their prey is helpless. Thor froze mid-stride, his body sinking low to the ground. One paw was lifted, his nose pointed dead into the wind, quivering. He had the scent, not of the enemy, but of something else, the flight suit. He let out a low, almost inaudible whine, a signal meant only for Jack. "Good boy," Jack whispered, his hand resting for a second on the dog's tense shoulders. "Show me." The dog moved again, no longer just descending, but tracking, his path now deliberate. He led Jack around a massive granite outcropping into a small, shielded clearing. And there she was. She was a splash of olive drab and pale skin against the dirty snow, tangled in a spiderweb of white parachute cords. Her helmet lay a few feet away, cracked. Her face, framed by sweat-matted dark hair, was young, etched with lines of pain even in semi-consciousness. Her flight suit was torn at the left thigh, revealing a gruesome mess of bone and blood, a stark crimson against the white. This was Captain Hannah Gallo, call sign Sparrow, a name that spoke of agility and speed, now rendered in broken stillness. Jack's mind split. The part that felt a shock of human connection was suppressed. The seal took over. He moved to her side in a fluid crouch, his carbine scanning the trees. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he said, his voice low and calm. Her eyelids fluttered. Dark eyes, clouded with pain, tried to focus on him. "Who?" The word was a dry rasp. "U.S. Navy. I'm here to help." He didn't wait for a reply. His hands were already moving, checking for other wounds, his gaze sweeping her body with practiced efficiency. Thor stood guard a few feet away. A silent, furred sentry, his head cocked, listening to the approaching enemy. Suddenly, Thor's ears flattened. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. "Contact," Jack breathed, the word hanging in the frozen air. He could hear them now. 4 men, moving carelessly through the undergrowth. Their voices were loud. They were close. Too close. Jack grabbed the emergency release on Hannah's harness, freeing her from the tangled cords. "Stay down. Don't move," he commanded, though he knew she couldn't. He gently dragged her behind a thicket of pines, the act forcing a sharp gasp of pain from her. There was no time for apologies. He gave a silent hand signal to Thor. Circle. Flank. Wait. The dog vanished into the shadows without a sound. Jack melted back behind a large, snow-dusted boulder, raising his carbine. He became part of the mountain again. He slowed his breathing. His heart was a cold, steady drumbeat. He was no longer a rescuer. He was a predator. The patrol entered the clearing. There were 4 of them in mismatched winter gear, carrying AK-style rifles. The leader was a big man with a thick black beard, a cruel smirk on his face as he surveyed the empty parachute. He looked like a man who enjoyed his work. Find her. He barked in rough English. She can't have gone far. One of the men, younger than the others, moved nervously toward the thicket where Hannah was hidden. He prodded the bushes with his rifle barrel. Jack's world narrowed to the red dot in his optic. He centered it on the leader's chest. Waited. A sudden, sharp growl erupted from the trees on the far side of the clearing. It was Thor. A perfect diversion. 3 of the men spun toward the sound, raising their rifles. The leader laughed. It's just a coyote. Forget it. But it was too late. Their attention was split. It was all Jack needed. His carbine coughed 3 times, the sound swallowed by the suppressor, no louder than the crack of a dry branch. The leader and the 2 men beside him crumpled without a sound, looks of surprise on their dead faces. They fell into the snow like puppets with their strings cut. The 4th man, the young one by the thicket, spun back around, his eyes wide with terror and confusion. He saw his comrades on the ground. He opened his mouth to shout a warning. He never got the chance. A dark shape exploded from the shadows behind him. Thor hit him at a full sprint, a 90-pound missile of muscle and fury. The man went down with a choked cry, his rifle flying from his hands. Thor's jaws clamped onto his arm, not to kill, but to control. The fight was over before the young merc even knew it had begun. Jack emerged from behind the boulder, carbine still up, and moved toward the captured man. Thor held the man down, growling, awaiting the command. Out, Jack said quietly. The dog released instantly and moved to Jack's side, his tail giving a single, satisfied wag. The young merc was whimpering, staring at the blood welling from the puncture wounds in his arm. He looked from Jack's cold eyes to the bodies of his friends, and the fight drained out of him. He surrendered to his fear. Jack had no time for a prisoner. He couldn't take him, and he couldn't leave him. He made a hard choice, disarming the man and using a zip tie to bind his hands. Stay here. Be quiet, he said. And you might live. It was a lie, but it would buy him time. He turned his back on the man and went to Hannah. The firefight had lasted less than 10 seconds. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of shock, fear, and a dawning, incredulous respect. She had seen the whole thing. You're fast, she managed. Have to be, Jack replied, already pulling his medical kit from his pack. All right, Captain. This is going to hurt. He cut away the shredded fabric of her flight suit. The wound was bad, an open femur fracture. The jagged end of the bone was visible. She was losing blood, and shock was setting in. He worked with a focused, impersonal calm. He applied a tourniquet high on her thigh, cranking it until the bleeding slowed to a trickle. He cleaned the wound as best he could with antiseptic wipes. He gave her a shot of morphine from his kit. Her head lolled back into the snow, her body going limp as the drug took hold. Sparrow, she stammered. Call me. Sparrow, Jack said, retrieving 2 rigid splints and tape from his pack. We need to set this, Sparrow. Brace yourself. He took hold of her leg. He didn't wait for her to be ready. He pulled. There was a sickening, grinding crunch of bone on bone. Even through the morphine, she let out a strangled scream, her body arching in agony before she passed out completely. Jack finished splinting the leg, wrapping it tightly until it was immobile. He checked her vitals, her pulse was thready, her breathing shallow, but she was stable for now. He stood, his own breath fogging in the cold. He looked down at her unconscious form. He had secured the package, but the package was a deadly liability. The nearest extraction point was miles of brutal mountain terrain away. The enemy now knew exactly where they were, and next time they would send more than a 4-man patrol. He looked at Thor, who sat patiently, watching him. The dog had done his part. Now it was Jack's turn. He had won the first battle. The real fight, the one for survival, had just begun. The gray light of dawn was just touching the highest peaks when Riker arrived. He didn't come in a noisy truck. He moved on foot, flanked by 2 silent men and a pair of massive Caucasus shepherds, their thick gray coats making them look more like bears than dogs. Riker himself was a man who seemed carved from the mountain granite. He was tall with the broad, unforgiving build of someone who had spent a lifetime in harsh environments. His face was a road map of brutal winters and forgotten wars, dominated by a pair of pale blue eyes that held no warmth, only a cold, analytical intelligence. He wore the clean, well-maintained uniform of the PMC, but the way he moved spoke of a different, more dangerous pedigree. This was a wolf in corporate clothing, a predator who now ruled this small, savage kingdom. He stopped at the edge of the clearing where Jack's brief, violent firefight had taken place. He didn't look at the frozen bodies of his men. His gaze was fixed on the snow, reading it like a book. "One man," Riker said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to absorb the silence around it. He knelt, his gloved finger hovering over the distinctive small shell casings nearly hidden in the snow. "Suppressed weapon. Professional." He walked to the body of the patrol leader. He noted the precise, tight grouping of the wounds. No panic, pure efficiency. His eyes then found the tracks. He saw the messy jumble of his patrol's boot prints. And then he saw the others, a single set of deep, deliberate prints from a man carrying a load, and next to them, the four-pawed prints of a dog, a large one. He followed the dog's tracks to where the young merc had been taken down. He saw the scuff marks, the drops of blood from the man's arm, and the single zip tie, cut and discarded in the snow. "He has a K9, Riker said, a flicker of what might have been professional respect in his cold eyes. "A disciplined one. It disabled, but didn't kill." He stood, his gaze sweeping the clearing. "He took out 4 of my men in seconds with a dog while protecting a wounded asset. This is no ordinary soldier." One of his men, a wiry tracker with a scarred face, pointed. "Commander, the pilots shoot." Riker walked over, kicking the tangled cords aside. He saw the cut harness, the discarded medical wrappers, and the faint drag marks in the snow where Jack had pulled Hannah into the trees. "The pilot is female," he stated, plucking a single dark hair from the snow. "And wounded. He's carrying her. This slows him down." He looked up at the vast, unforgiving mountains that surrounded them. "But it also makes him more dangerous. A cornered animal protecting its own is the most dangerous of all." Just then, a patrol brought the young merc forward, the one Jack had tied up. The man was shivering, his face a mask of terror. He saw Riker and began to stammer, trying to explain the silent, sudden ambush. Riker held up a hand, silencing him. He walked slowly around the young man, his pale eyes examining him like a defective piece of equipment. "You were on point?" Riker asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Yes, Commander." "You saw nothing, heard nothing?" "No, sir. It was like ghosts, one sound, then they were all." Riker stopped in front of him. "You would have been the first man a professional killed. But you're alive. Why?" The soldier had no answer. He just shook his head, tears of fear freezing on his cheeks. "Because you're a boy," Riker said, the softness gone from his voice, replaced by contempt. "And he didn't see you as a threat. He was conserving ammunition. He saw you as a wasted bullet. He made one mistake," he said to his tracker. "Compassion is a weakness we do not share." He nodded once, an almost imperceptible gesture. Behind him, there was a single, muffled gunshot. The young soldier's body slumped into the snow. Riker didn't flinch. "Get the forward teams on the radio," he ordered, his eyes already scanning the faint trail leading out of the clearing. "I want this entire valley locked down. No one gets in or out. I want patrols on every ridge." He turned to his dog handler, the man who controlled his 2 giant shepherds. "The scent is cold, but the American's dog will have left its own trail. Let Boris and Ivan hunt." The handler, a grim man as large as his dogs, unleashed the 2 beasts. They didn't bark. They lowered their massive heads to the snow where Thor had stood, their deep chests vibrating as they drank in the scent of their quarry. Riker stared at the path Jack had taken, a route leading up into the treacherous, snow-covered peaks. He pictured the American SEAL, burdened by a wounded pilot, hunted by his men, and now by his dogs. A slow, cruel smile touched Riker's lips. "He's running for high ground," he murmured to himself. "He thinks the rocks and the wind will hide his trail. He thinks he's the wolf." The 2 Caucasus shepherds, having found the scent, let out a pair of deep, baying howls in unison that echoed through the valley. It was a sound of primal hunger, a promise of violence to come. Riker listened, the sound like music to his ears. "But in these mountains," he finished, pulling his collar tighter against the biting wind, "I am the apex predator." The hunt was on. Pain was a constant. For Jack, it was the chafe of pack straps and the deep, grinding ache in his legs and back from the dead weight of the pilot he carried. For Hannah, it was a throbbing, radiant agony in her leg, a fire that was slowly being replaced by a deadly, creeping cold. Jack moved with a steady, determined rhythm, a human machine fueled by sheer will. He had fashioned a makeshift harness, distributing Hannah's weight as best he could, but every step was a battle. She was a leaden burden, her unconsciousness a deeper weight than any piece of gear he had ever carried. Thor ranged ahead, a four-legged scout in a world that was rapidly turning a uniform, blinding white. The sky, once a cold, clear blue, was now the color of dirty wool. The wind no longer bit. It howled, driving a horizontal snow that stung like sand. A blizzard had descended on the Bighorns with the sudden, violent ferocity of a predator. At first, it was a blessing. The thick, swirling snow was erasing their tracks as fast as they made them. The baying of Riker's hounds had faded, swallowed by the roar of the storm. They were ghosts in the white, invisible. But the blessing was turning into a curse. The temperature plummeted. Jack's own breath froze on his gaiter and the world shrank to the few chaotic feet in front of him. He was navigating by instinct and the unwavering focus of his dog. He felt a change in the woman on his back. A tremor ran through her body that had nothing to do with the cold. He stopped, shifting her weight to place a gloved hand on her forehead. Even through the thick fabric, he could feel the radiating heat. Fever. A bad one. The makeshift dressing on her wound wasn't enough. Infection was setting in. Sparrow. Hannah. Stay with me. He growled, the words torn away by the wind. Her only response was a delirious mumble. He knew they couldn't last much longer out in the open. The cold and the fever would kill her before Riker ever found them. They needed shelter, now. Thor seemed to understand. The dog stopped, his nose high, ignoring the path ahead and turning sharply left toward a seemingly featureless rock face. He let out a single, sharp, urgent bark. Jack trusted the dog more than his own exhausted senses. He followed, pushing through waist-deep drifts until he stood before the wall of stone. Thor was pawing at a snow-covered curtain of vines clinging to the rock. Jack pushed it aside. Behind it was a dark slit, a narrow opening just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. A cave. Getting inside was a clumsy, desperate affair. He had to unharness Hannah, carefully setting her down in the snow before squeezing through the entrance himself. The space inside was small, no larger than a big closet, and smelled of damp earth and something wild and musky, but it was out of the wind. The roar of the blizzard was instantly muffled to a low, distant moan. It was sanctuary. He pulled Hannah inside, followed by Thor. The dog immediately shook a cascade of snow from his coat and then began licking the ice from his master's boots. Jack gently laid Hannah down, using his pack to pillow her head. Her skin was flushed, her breathing rapid and shallow. He had to get her warm. He had to get water into her. He needed a fire. Everything was wet. The few scraps of dry wood he could find in the cave were slick with damp. For a normal person, it would be impossible. But Jack's training was forged in the impossible. He took out his knife and began shaving thin, feathery curls from the driest part of a branch's core. He arranged them in a small, loose pile. Then he took a small, putty-like block from a waterproof pouch in his pack. C4. A soldier's trick. He pinched off a pea-sized amount and worked it into the tinder. He struck his ferro rod, sending a shower of white-hot sparks into the pile. The C4 caught with a brilliant, intense flash, and the tinder instantly ignited. The tiny flame flickered, threatening to die. Jack shielded it with his body, breathing a gentle, steady stream of air on it, nurturing it, feeding it tiny slivers of wood until it grew from a spark to a flame, and from a flame to a small, crackling fire. The faint light pushed back the oppressive dark, casting dancing shadows on the cave walls. It was a tiny beacon of life in a dead white world. He packed snow into his metal canteen cup and set it beside the fire. As it melted, he turned his attention back to Hannah. He gently wiped her face with a handful of clean snow. Her eyes were closed, her brow furrowed in a fever dream. "Water soon," he murmured, not sure if she could hear him. "Just hold on." She mumbled something. Her voice was slurred. "Dad, I'm okay." The words hit Jack harder than the cold. For a moment, she wasn't Captain Gallo, the downed asset. She was just Hannah, someone's daughter. He felt a protective instinct that went beyond the mission, a raw human connection forged in shared peril. When the water was warm, he lifted her head, carefully tipping the cup to her cracked lips. She coughed, but managed to swallow a little. He kept at it, a slow, patient process. Thor, his guard duty temporarily suspended, crept into the space between them, curling up and pressing his solid, warm body against Hannah's shivering form. He rested his head on her arm, a living, silent comfort. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, a constant, howling reminder of their isolation. Jack worked tirelessly. He redressed Hannah's wound with the last of his sterile bandages. He kept the fire going. He kept trickling warm water into her mouth. He watched her, the firelight dancing on her face. He saw the strength in the line of her jaw, the determination there, even in unconsciousness. She was a fighter. He just had to keep her in the fight. Sometime in the middle of the night, as he was adding another piece of wood to the fire, her eyes opened. They were clear for a moment, the fever haze receded. She looked at him, then at Thor curled beside her, then at the small fire. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice frail. "We save each other," Jack replied, his own voice rough with exhaustion. "Now get some rest, Sparrow." A faint smile touched her lips before her eyes closed again. Jack leaned his head back against the cold stone wall of the cave, a bone-deep weariness settling into his marrow. The immediate crisis was averted, but he knew this sanctuary was only temporary. He could hear it even over the storm, a faint, mournful sound, almost lost on the wind. The howling of Riker's dogs. The storm had hidden them, but it wouldn't last forever. And the hunters were still out there, patient, relentless, and getting closer. The storm broke with the dawn. The wind died, leaving behind a profound, muffled silence. The snow had stopped, and a weak gray light filtered into the cave, illuminating the three figures within. Jack hadn't slept. He sat near the entrance, his carbine across his lap, listening. Hannah was sleeping, her fever having broken slightly, her breathing deeper and more regular. Thor lay beside her, a living, warm guardian, but his sleep was not deep. His ears constantly twitched, sampling the new, still air. The silence was the new enemy. It was a canvas on which any sound, the snap of a twig, the crunch of a boot, would be painted in stark, deadly clarity. The storm had been a cloak. This silence was a spotlight. Thor's head came up from his paws. He didn't growl. He didn't move. He simply went rigid, his entire body becoming a single line of taut muscle. He stared at the narrow cave entrance, a low rumble, more felt than heard, vibrating in his chest. It was the quietest, most dangerous sound he could make. Jack was on his feet instantly, moving with a silence that mirrored his dog's. He placed a hand on Hannah's shoulder, her eyes opened, still cloudy, but aware. "Don't make a sound," Jack breathed, his voice barely a whisper. He pressed his back to the rock wall beside the entrance, his carbine up, the scope now useless in the tight space. He aimed down the iron sights. He could hear it now, the faint crunch of snow, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the sound of a large patrol. This was a smaller, more specialized team. Trackers. He risked a glance through a small crack in the rock. He saw two men and the two massive dogs moving through the pines. One was the cold-faced handler Jack had seen in his scope before, a man built like a barrel with hands that looked capable of crushing rock. He held the leashes of the two Caucasus shepherds, Boris and Ivan, who strained against their leads, their massive heads low to the ground. The second man walked a few paces behind, rifle at the ready. They were moving straight for the hidden entrance. The dogs had found them. Thor took a single step forward, his claws clicking softly on the stone floor. He planted himself in the narrow entrance, a living barrier of fur and honed instinct. He offered no challenge. He simply waited. Outside, the handler paused. The big dogs were whining now, a high, eager sound, pawing at the snow-covered vines. "Here," the handler grunted to his partner. "They're in here." He unclipped the leashes. "Go," he ordered. "Find." The two big dogs didn't hesitate. The first one, a brute with a scarred muzzle, shoved its head through the entrance. It was met not by a bark, but by Thor's silent, shocking charge. The fight was a contained explosion of fury in the narrow space. Thor, lighter by at least 50 pounds, didn't try to match the shepherd's brute strength. He was a fencer against a brawler. He dodged the bigger dog's clumsy lunges and struck like a cobra, his teeth sinking deep into the thick ruff of the shepherd's neck, using his agility to twist and pull the larger dog off balance. The second shepherd tried to crowd in behind the first, its deep barks echoing like gunshots in the enclosed space. From her position, Hannah could see only a chaotic blur of black and tan and gray fur, hear the terrible sounds of snarls, yelps, and bodies slamming against rock. Jack ignored the animal battle. His focus was absolute. The second man was raising his rifle, trying to get a clear shot into the cave. Jack's carbine fired twice. The suppressed shots were lost in the noise of the dogfight. The second man jerked, a look of surprise on his face before he pitched forward into the snow. The handler roared in anger and surprise, dropping to one knee and bringing his own weapon up. But the battle in the entrance had shifted. Thor, using the tight space to his advantage, had savaged the lead dog's leg. The big shepherd howled in pain and tried to back out, creating a momentary opening. It was all Jack needed. He fired again, a single, precise shot. The handler slumped over, his rifle firing harmlessly into the sky. The cave fell silent, except for the harsh, ragged panting of the dogs. The second shepherd, its handler dead, seemed confused. It backed away from the entrance, barking uncertainly. Thor stood his ground in the entrance, his black and tan coat matted with snow and blood, some of it his, some of it the enemy's. His flank was bleeding from a deep gash where the other dog's teeth had torn through, and he was limping, favoring his left front leg. But he held his ground, a low growl still vibrating in his chest. The remaining shepherd, its pack leader gone, gave one last frustrated bark before turning and trotting back the way it had come, disappearing into the woods. It was a hunter, not a soldier. Without a master, the fight was over. The immediate threat was gone. Jack moved quickly out of the cave, his weapon scanning the trees. The area was clear. He checked the bodies. Both men were dead. He took their spare ammunition, a radio, and a small pack of dried meat. Every resource mattered. He turned back inside and found a scene of quiet devastation. Hannah was sitting up, her face pale, her knuckles white where she gripped her splinted leg. Her eyes were locked on Thor. The dog had finally relaxed his guard. He limped to Jack, whining softly, and pushed his bloody head into his master's hand. "You did good, boy. You did real good," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. He knelt and ran his hands over the dog, assessing the damage. The gash on his flank was deep, but not life-threatening. The paw was sprained, painful, but manageable. He used the last of his clean bandages to wrap the dog's bleeding side. Thor licked his hand, a quiet acceptance of the pain. Jack looked from his wounded dog to the wounded woman. He had won another fight, but the cost was mounting. Their advantage of silence and invisibility was gone. The shots, even suppressed, and the dogfight would have been heard. The dead patrol would be discovered within the hour. Riker would know exactly where they were. They couldn't stay. "We have to move," he said, his voice flat. "Now." Hannah nodded, her eyes filled with a new, hard-won understanding of the man and the dog who were keeping her alive. "I can try to walk." "No," Jack said, already repacking his gear with the scavenged supplies. "You'll slow us down and damage the leg more." He looked at her, his expression grim. "The ride's not over yet, Sparrow." He shouldered his pack, then knelt in front of her. "Up." With a pained grunt, she put her arms around his neck. He stood, hoisting her in a fireman's carry, her weight now a familiar, aching burden. They stepped out of the cave into the cold, bright morning. The world was pristine and beautiful, the snow on the pines glittering in the new sun. It was a deadly illusion. Thor limped ahead, his loyalty overriding his pain. Jack followed, carrying the pilot. They left the sanctuary of the cave and the bodies of their enemies behind, moving once more into the white, silent wilderness. A broken, hunted, and solitary team. Every step was a negotiation with pain. Jack's world had shrunk to the next tree, the next rock, the next agonizing shift of Hannah's weight on his shoulders. The adrenaline from the firefight had long since faded, leaving a profound, cellular exhaustion. The scavenged radio was useless, its frequencies dead, and the mountains seemed to stretch into an endless, unforgiving landscape. Thor's limp had worsened, but the dog showed no sign of stopping. He continued to scout ahead, a three-legged ghost of determination, his loyalty a silent rebuke to Jack's own fading strength. They found the ranger station by sheer luck. It was a relic from another era, a small, square cabin of dark, weathered logs, half buried in a snowdrift. Its windows were boarded up, its porch roof sagging. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, a wooden skeleton left to rot in the forest. But it was shelter. 4 walls and a roof. It was paradise. The door was unlocked, hanging on a single rusted hinge. Jack shouldered it open, the screech of wood loud in the silent woods. He carefully lowered Hannah onto a dusty mattress that lay on a simple metal frame, the only piece of furniture left in the single, dark room. The air was thick with the smell of rot, dust, and the ghost of old wood smoke. He shrugged off his pack, his body screaming in protest. While Thor collapsed by the door, an exhausted but vigilant guard, Jack got to work. He pried a few loose floorboards from a ruined section of the wall, using them for kindling. Soon, a small, smoky fire was crackling in the rusted iron stove, chasing away some of the damp chill. For the first time in days, they weren't moving. They weren't being actively hunted. The silence was a physical presence. It pressed in on Jack, no longer a comfort, but avoid. Out in the open, his senses were sharp, focused outward on the threat. Here, in the confines of the small, dark room, his focus turned inward, and the things inside were far more dangerous than Riker. He checked on Hannah. Her fever had returned with a vengeance. She was shivering uncontrollably despite the growing warmth from the stove. He pulled his last thermal blanket over her. She was mumbling again, lost in a delirium that was taking her far away from this cold, dark place. He was rationing their last food, the few strips of jerky he'd taken from the dead trackers. He sat on the floor by the bed, forcing himself to eat, watching her. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe in his peripheral vision. The steady crackle of the flames sounded like distant gunfire. The whistle of wind through a chink in the wall sounded like a scream. He was so tired. His eyelids were lead weights. Just for a minute, he thought. He closed his eyes. He wasn't in Wyoming anymore. He was in Ramadi. The air wasn't cold. It was thick and hot and smelled of dust, diesel, and cooking spices. He was in a small, mud-walled room, clearing a compound. The silence was the same, that heavy, expectant silence before the blast. Jack. The whisper pulled him from the edge of sleep. He opened his eyes. Hannah was looking at him, her eyes wide and unfocused with fever. So cold, she whispered, her teeth chattering. He moved to adjust the blanket, his movement sluggish. Just hold on, he said, his own voice sounding distant. As he leaned over her, she reached out, her hand surprisingly strong, and gripped his forearm. Don't go, she pleaded, her delirious gaze locked on his face. The touch was a live wire. The firelight on her face became the blinding glare of a headlamp. Her dark hair was a black hijab. Her pleading eyes were the dark, hate-filled eyes of a woman he'd cornered in a dusty room years ago. A woman who had smiled at him just before she detonated the vest she wore under her robes. The memory wasn't a memory. It was real. The ranger station dissolved. He was back there. The smell of C4 filled his nostrils. His ears rang with the phantom echo of the explosion. His skin tingled with the remembered heat of the blast that had killed his two best friends. His training, his deepest, most primal survival instincts, took over. This was a threat. The hand on his arm was not a plea for comfort. It was the prelude to an attack. No. He roared, the sound ripped from a part of him he kept locked away. He moved with brutal speed. He twisted, breaking her grip, his other hand coming up to pin her by the throat, driving her back into the mattress. He wasn't trying to kill her. He was trying to control the threat, to stop the bomb. His entire being was focused on a single, blindingly clear objective: neutralize the target before she kills him and everyone in this room. Hannah let out a choked, terrified cry, her fever haze shattered by the sudden violence. She stared up at the man above her. His eyes weren't his. They were wide, vacant, looking through her at a ghost only he could see. She clawed at the hand on her throat, but his grip was iron. Thor had been asleep, a deep, healing sleep. But at Hannah's cry, and the sudden, violent change in his master's scent, that sharp chemical tang of pure, undiluted terror, he was instantly awake. He saw the scene, his master, his pack leader, pinning the wounded woman he had been protecting. It made no sense. His instincts screamed that something was wrong. This wasn't a fight. This was a malfunction. He didn't attack. He acted. He launched himself from the doorway, his injured leg protesting. He didn't bite. He slammed his body, a 90-pound battering ram of solid muscle, directly into Jack's side. The impact knocked Jack off balance. His grip on Hannah loosened. Get back! He snarled, shoving the dog away, still trapped in the delusion. Thor came again. This time he wedged his big head between Jack's chest and Hannah's face, physically separating them. And then he barked. It wasn't a warning growl or a battle cry. It was a series of loud, sharp, concussive barks that exploded like gunshots right in Jack's face. It was an alarm, a desperate, shocking sound designed to shatter the phantom world Jack was trapped in. Wake up! Wake up! You are here! The sound, the physical pressure of the dog. It was a lifeline. The mud walls of Ramadi dissolved. The smell of dust and cordite vanished, replaced by the smell of wood smoke and wet dog. The ringing in his ears faded. He looked down. He saw his own hand, knuckles white, still pressed against Hannah's collarbone. He saw her tear-streaked face, her eyes wide with terror. He saw Thor, whining, pressing against him, his amber eyes filled with desperate concern. The horror of what he had almost done crashed over him like a physical blow. He recoiled as if burned, scrambling back from the bed, away from her until his back hit the far wall. He slid to the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. He buried his head in his hands, his body racked with silent, violent shudders. "Oh God," he choked out, the words muffled. "Hannah, I didn't." He couldn't finish. The ghosts had come back, and this time he was the monster. The room was silent, except for his own ragged gasps. After a long moment, a quiet voice cut through the darkness. "Jack." He looked up. Hannah had pushed herself into a sitting position, ignoring the pain in her leg. She was watching him, not with fear anymore, but with a deep, aching sadness. In his moment of lost control, she had seen past the seal. She had seen the wounded man underneath. "It's okay," she said, her voice soft but steady. "You're here. You're with us." Thor limped over to Jack and nudged his head under his master's trembling hand, grounding him, anchoring him to the real world. Jack wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in its thick fur. The soldier was gone. The rescuer was gone. All that was left was a haunted, broken man in a dark cabin miles from home. The silence in the ranger station was different now. It was no longer a void for ghosts to fill, but a space of shared, unspoken understanding. In the wake of the incident, a new, fragile trust had formed between them, forged in the crucible of Jack's exposed vulnerability and Hannah's quiet acceptance. They left at first light. Jack moved with a stiff, careful precision, his face a mask of cold professionalism, but Hannah could see the exhaustion etched deep around his eyes. She, for her part, refused to be carried. Using a thick branch as a crutch, she gritted her teeth against the fire in her leg and moved with a slow, painful determination. They were a broken team, but they were a team. Thor, limping but resolute, took point. His wound had slowed him, but his senses were as sharp as ever. He was their compass and their alarm bell. For hours, they moved through the thinning forest, heading steadily upward. Jack had a destination in mind, a secondary extraction point, a last-ditch option on his mission map designated as LZ-3. It was a high, isolated plateau, the only place a helicopter might risk a landing in this terrain. But there was only one way to get there. They reached the canyon's edge at midday. It was a vast, open wound in the earth, a 1,000-foot sheer drop to a frozen river below. The wind howled through it, a constant, mournful cry, and spanning the abyss was the bridge. It was a nightmare of rusted steel cable and rotting wooden planks, a skeletal finger pointing across the void. It swayed with every gust of wind, a gossamer thread of hope in a landscape of despair. "You have got to be kidding me," Hannah breathed, her voice a mixture of awe and horror as she stared at the swaying structure. "This is it," Jack said, his voice flat. "The LZ is on the other side. It's our only way." He scanned the far side of the canyon with his rifle scope, his movement slow and deliberate. He wasn't looking for a patrol. He was looking for anything out of place. A broken branch, a shadow that didn't move with the sun. Thor, standing at the very edge, let out a low, almost inaudible growl. The hackles on his neck were raised, his gaze fixed on the distant cliff face. And then Jack saw it. A tiny glint of light high in the rocks overlooking the far end of the bridge. It wasn't a reflection from ice. It was the sun hitting glass optics. A sniper scope. Down. He hissed, pulling Hannah behind a cluster of boulders. They were trapped. Riker hadn't just followed them. He had gotten ahead of them. He knew this was their only route, and he had set a perfect trap. He didn't want to kill them on the bridge. He wanted them to cross, to walk right into his grasp where they could be captured. Jack's mind raced, cycling through a dozen impossible scenarios. There was no going back. Riker's main force would be closing in from behind. There was no way around the canyon. This bridge was the only way, a path that led directly into a kill zone. He looked at Hannah. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She was a pilot. She understood calculated risks. He looked at Thor. The dog was watching him, waiting for the command. Its trust was absolute. There was only one option. A bad one, but it was the only one they had. "He's waiting for us to cross," Jack said, his voice low and tight. "He wants you alive, Sparrow. That gives us a chance." "What chance?" she asked, her knuckles white on her crutch. "I'm going to give him a target he can't ignore," Jack said. He looked her directly in the eye. "You and Thor are going across that bridge. You move as fast as you can. Don't look back. There's a rock formation on the other side about 50 yards from the bridge. Get to it. Get down and wait." "No," she said instantly. "Absolutely not. We are not leaving you." "That's an order, Captain." He snapped, his voice hard as steel. He immediately regretted the tone, But there was no time for softness. He wants you, which means he won't shoot until you're on his side. I'll stay here and make sure he can't get to you. I'm going to be a very loud, very annoying distraction. He knelt in front of Thor, taking the dog's scarred head in his hands. Listen to me, boy, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He looked from the dog to Hannah. Get her across. Protect. You understand me? Protect her. Thor whined, pressing his head into Jack's chest, sensing the finality in his master's voice. Go, Jack said, his voice breaking for a fraction of a second. Go now. Hannah hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. Jack. Go. She turned, leaning heavily on her crutch with one hand and gripping Thor's harness with the other. She began the terrifying journey. The limping dog and the wounded woman moved out onto the bridge. The structure groaned and swayed under their weight. The wind tore at them. Every step was a lifetime. Jack watched them go, his heart a cold knot. He watched until they were halfway across the abyss, a tiny, vulnerable pair against the vast emptiness. Then he turned, settled himself in the rocks at the mouth of the bridge, and raised his rifle. Hey! He roared, his voice echoing across the canyon. Riker! You want to fight? I'm right here. The response was immediate. The sniper's first shot wasn't at him, it was at the cable right next to his head. A ricochet whined past, kicking up sparks. A warning. Then the rest of the ambush opened up. Muzzle flashes winked from a dozen positions in the rocks on the other side. A hail of bullets hammered the rocks around Jack, shattering stone. The air filled with the angry zip of supersonic rounds. Jack didn't panic. He was a rock in the storm. He returned fire, not wildly, but in controlled, 3-round bursts. He wasn't trying to hit them. He was trying to keep their heads down. He was buying time. He saw Hannah and Thor reach the other side. They scrambled off the bridge and began the slow, painful crawl toward the rocks. Almost there. He changed magazines, the movement practiced, smooth, and automatic. He rose up to fire again. This time, the pain was a white-hot explosion in his left shoulder. It felt like being hit with a sledgehammer. The impact spun him around, slamming him into the rock wall. His carbine fell from numb fingers. The world tilted, the edges of his vision going gray. He could feel the warm, wet rush of blood soaking through his gear. He looked across the canyon. Hannah had frozen, her face a mask of horror. Keep going. He roared, his voice a raw, painful rasp. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the fire in his shoulder. He fumbled for his rifle with his good hand. He was exposed. He was bleeding out. But Hannah wasn't safe yet. He got a grip on the stock, hooked his finger through the trigger guard, and dragged himself back into a firing position. Bracing the weapon on the rock, he aimed one-handed. The roar of the firefight filled the world, but all he could hear was the frantic, desperate beat of his own heart. He just had to hold on a little longer. The world was a roaring, vibrating tunnel. Bullets hammered the rocks around Jack, peppering his face with stone dust. The fire in his shoulder had become a raging inferno, and his left arm was a dead, useless weight. Across the chasm, he could see Hannah and Thor were behind the rock formation, safe for the moment. But for how long? He knew he couldn't hold this position. He was bleeding to death, and his one-handed marksmanship was erratic at best. He was just a temporary barrier, and Riker knew it. The moment Jack went down, Riker's men would find a way across. He had to destroy the bridge for good. Gritting his teeth against a wave of nausea, he fumbled in his pack with his good hand. His fingers closed around the cold, dense block of C4, his last one. He crawled, dragging his broken body toward the mouth of the bridge. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony through him. Bullets zipped over his head. He reached the main suspension cable on his side. A thick, rusted braid of steel wire anchored into the rock. Working one-handed was a clumsy, desperate nightmare. He pressed the explosive against the cable anchor, his fingers fumbling with the detonator on its short fuse timer. He set it for 30 seconds, it was all the time he could afford. He looked across the canyon one last time. Hannah was watching him, her face a pale oval of horror. He gave her a single, sharp nod. Get ready to move. He armed the charge. A small red light began to blink. 30 seconds. He didn't crawl back to his firing position. He staggered to his feet and ran. It was a lurching, stumbling run, fueled by pure adrenaline. He ran away from the bridge toward the designated extraction point somewhere on the plateau behind him. He had to put as much distance as he could between himself and the blast. He heard a roar of fury from Riker across the canyon as his men realized what was happening. The volume of fire increased, a desperate, angry stream of lead chasing him. He counted the seconds in his head. 5. 4. 3. He threw himself behind a low ridge of rock just as the world went white. The explosion wasn't a crack. It was a deep, gut-wrenching boom that shook the very foundations of the mountain. The sound was followed by the high, tortured shriek of tortured metal. He looked back. The near side of the bridge was gone, the anchor point vaporized. The rest of the structure, its support severed, whipped violently before peeling away from the far cliff face, plunging into the abyss in a tangle of cable and broken timber. The path was cut. They were safe from pursuit. The silence that followed was deafening. The gunfire from the other side had stopped. Jack could picture Riker standing on the opposite cliff, his face a mask of rage, utterly defeated. The adrenaline faded and the pain returned with a vengeance. Jack lay in the snow, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged gasps. His vision began to tunnel. The bright white snowscape turned gray at the edges. Jack! He heard Hannah's voice, faint and far away. He tried to push himself up, but his body refused to obey. He felt a wet nose push insistently at his face, followed by a low, worried whine. Thor! The dog was licking his cheek, his presence a desperate plea for him to get up. He forced his eyes open. Hannah was kneeling beside him, her face streaked with tears and dirt. She had used her crutch to get to him. "You absolute idiot," she whispered, her voice choked with a mixture of fury and relief. "A magnificent idiot." "LZ," Jack managed to breathe, the single word a monumental effort. "Have to get to the LZ." "We'll get there," she said, her voice gaining a new strength. "Together." It was a slow, agonizing journey. Hannah put his good arm over her shoulders, taking as much of his weight as she could. Jack leaned on her, his feet dragging through the snow. Thor walked on his other side, pressed against him, a living crutch of fur and loyalty. They were a three-headed, five-legged creature, stumbling through the snow, every step a triumph of will over a failing body. Jack was fading. The world was a blurry watercolor of white and gray. He could hear his own heart beat, slow and heavy. He was so cold. He was going to fail. After everything, he was going to die here on this frozen plateau. And then he heard it. It started as a faint, rhythmic whump-whump that seemed to come from inside his own head. He thought he was hallucinating. But then Thor stopped. The dog's head went up, his ears pricked, and he let out a single, joyous bark. The sound grew louder, a deep, powerful heartbeat that vibrated through the snow. Hannah looked up, her eyes wide. "Do you hear that?" Over the ridge, a black shape appeared against the gray sky. A UH-60 Blackhawk. It roared toward them, its dark form a beautiful, terrible angel of mercy. The side door was open, and he could see the shapes of the door gunners behind their miniguns. The helicopter didn't land. It couldn't. It settled into a low, stable hover about 50 feet above them. As it did, its guns began to fire, not at them, but at the far side of the canyon, laying down a devastating field of suppressive fire. One last, angry message to Riker. A cable snaked down from the belly of the beast, and a heavily geared figure slid down it with practice speed, a PJ, a pararescueman. He hit the ground running, a medpack in his hand. He was at their side, his face obscured by his helmet and goggles, but his presence was an overwhelming wave of calm and competence. "I've got you," he said, his voice clear and steady over the roar of the rotors. He was already at work on Jack, cutting away his gear, applying a chest seal to the wound with quick, expert hands. "You're going home." Another hoist was lowered. The PJ secured it around Hannah first, then Thor, who accepted the strange equipment with trusting calm. They were pulled up, rising into the sky, disappearing into the dark belly of the helicopter. Then it was Jack's turn. The PJ clipped him in. The last thing he saw of the mountain was the snow, the rocks, and the deep chasm that had nearly been his grave. Then the world was roaring wind and the rising floor of the Blackhawk. Hands pulled him inside. The noise was immense, a physical force of engines and rotor wash. The door slid shut, and the sound of the battle was cut off, replaced by the steady, powerful roar of their escape. He lay on the floor, the PJ still working on him. He saw Thor was safe, and he saw Hannah. She crawled over to him, her face inches from his. The noise was too loud to speak. She simply took his good hand, her grip surprisingly strong, her eyes, clear and filled with an emotion he couldn't name, locked on his, a silent, "Thank you," a promise. Thor, exhausted and wounded, limped over and collapsed beside them, resting his heavy head on their joined hands. The three of them, a broken, battered, and unbreakable team, finally going home. As Jack felt the darkness pull at the edge of his vision, The last thing he was aware of was the warmth of her hand and the solid weight of his dog. He hadn't failed.